Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday, the kind that makes the world outside your window look like a watercolor painting left out in a storm. I was curled up on the sofa with a lukewarm cup of tea, idly watching the news, when Mark, my husband, came home. He was soaked, despite his umbrella, and had a look on his face I hadn't seen in a while, a mixture of excitement and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You won't believe who I ran into today, Ellie," he said, shaking his coat off by the door, sending a spray of droplets onto the hallway runner. "Julian Vance. Remember Julian?" Of course, I remembered Julian. He'd been Mark's best friend back in college, practically a brother. They'd started a small tech business together, full of dreams and late nights fueled by cheap pizza. Julian was the charismatic one, the visionary, while Mark was the steady hand, the pragmatist. Then Julian had moved out west, chasing a bigger dream, and their paths had diverged. We'd seen him maybe twice in the last 20 years, at a college reunion, and once when he was in town for a conference. He was always pleasant, a little distant perhaps, but then again, time and distance have a way of changing people, don't they? "Julian," I said, surprised. "Wow, it's been ages. What's he doing back in town?" "He's here for a few weeks, sorting out some family business, apparently." We had coffee. It was good, really good to see him. Mark was toweling his hair, but his eyes were bright. He asked about you. Asked if we could all have dinner before he leaves. And that's how it started, innocently enough. Dinner was scheduled for the following Friday at a new Italian place downtown that everyone was raving about. I found myself looking forward to it more than I usually did for these kinds of things. Maybe it was the rain or the quiet hum of the house these days with the kids grown and gone, but the thought of a lively dinner with an old friend of Mark's felt like a small adventure. The week passed in its usual rhythm. Work at the library, my book club on Wednesday, a long call with our daughter, Sarah, who was navigating her first year of teaching. I didn't think much about Julian, beyond wondering what he looked like now, if he still had that easy laugh that used to make Mark chuckle so readily. Friday night arrived, crisp and clear after the week's rain. I chose a deep blue dress, one Mark had always liked, and even put on a bit more makeup than usual. Mark was already dressed, pacing a little, which was unusual for him. "You okay, honey?" I asked, adjusting an earring. Yeah, it's been a long time, you know. With Julian. Hope it's not awkward." "Why would it be awkward?" I smoothed his collar. "He's an old friend." The restaurant was buzzing, all gleaming wood and soft lighting. Julian was already there, standing at the bar. He turned as we approached, and I had to admit, he'd aged well. The boyish charm was still there, but it was overlaid with a kind of quiet intensity now. His hair was more silver than I remembered, and there were lines around his eyes, but they were good lines, laugh lines, thinking lines. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Mark, and Eleanor, you look wonderful." His voice was deeper than I recalled, smooth. Dinner was surprisingly easy. The conversation flowed, mostly between Mark and Julian, reminiscing about old times, catching up on the intervening years. Julian spoke of his work, some kind of software development that was clearly very successful, but he didn't dwell on it. He had a way of asking questions, of drawing people out. He asked me about my work at the library, about my garden, and he listened, really listened, with an attentiveness that was both flattering and a little unnerving. I found myself talking more than I usually did with strangers, or even with some friends. There was a comfortable intimacy that settled over our table, a sense of old connections rekindled and new ones quietly forming. Towards the end of the evening, Mark excused himself to take a call from his brother. Julian and I were left alone, the remnants of tiramisu and coffee cups between us. The restaurant sounds seemed to fade a little. "Mark seems really happy to have reconnected with you, Julian," I said, stirring my cooling coffee. He looked at me then, a direct, thoughtful gaze. "And I with him. He's a good man, Eleanor. You've built a good life together." "We've had our ups and downs, like everyone," I replied, a little surprised by his directness. "But yes, it's a good life." He was quiet for a moment, swirling the ice in his water glass. Then he said, his voice very soft, "Eleanor, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous or out of line, but I've found myself in a rather unusual situation, and I find myself thinking you might be someone who could understand, or perhaps offer a perspective I haven't considered." I felt a flicker of something. Curiosity, maybe a touch of apprehension. "Oh, what kind of situation?" He looked around as if to make sure Mark wasn't returning just yet. Then he leaned in slightly, his eyes holding mine. "I'm going to be in town for another 2 weeks, and I find I have a great deal of thinking to do about my life, my future. Things have become rather complicated for me lately, and I was wondering." He paused, and for the first time that evening, he seemed hesitant. "I was wondering if you would consider spending an evening with me. Just talking. I would, of course, compensate you for your time, generously." I must have looked confused because he quickly added, "I know that sounds crass. Let me rephrase. I'm looking for companionship, Eleanor. Intelligent conversation. A different point of view. Someone to simply be with while I process some things. I'd be willing to offer $50,000 for one evening of your time, your conversation, your insights." $50,000. The words hung in the air between us, absurd and shocking. My mind reeled. Was this a joke? A very, very strange, unfunny joke. I looked at his face. He was perfectly serious. There was no smirk, no hidden agenda in his eyes that I could detect, just a kind of weary sincerity. My first instinct was a rush of indignation. How dare he? Did he think I was for sale? But his demeanor, his careful phrasing, the genuine plea in his eyes, it all warred with that initial reaction. He wasn't looking at me with desire, not in that way. It was something else, something I couldn't name. The offer was outrageous, of course, but the request beneath it. It felt strangely vulnerable. Before I could formulate any kind of response, before I could even process the sheer audacity of it, Mark was walking back to the table, smiling, oblivious. "Sorry about that, folks. Bill's having a bit of a drama with his teenager. You know how it is." Julian straightened up, his expression shifting back to easy neutrality, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened, as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb into the middle of my tiramisu. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I laughed at the right moments, nodded, contributed to the conversation, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying Julian's words, his gaze, the impossible sum of money. $50,000 for a night, for conversation. It was the most bizarre proposal I'd ever heard. We said our goodbye. Etapa Julian gave me a small, unreadable look as we parted ways. "It was a pleasure, Eleanor." Mark. In the car on the way home, Mark was buoyant. "Wasn't that great? Just like old times. Julian hasn't changed a bit, not really." I murmured something non-committal. My head was spinning. What did it mean? What did he really want? And why me? I barely knew the man. The drive home felt longer than usual, each streetlight we passed illuminating the conflict raging inside me. Part of me was offended deeply. Another, smaller, more curious part was intrigued, not by the money, not really. Though $50,000, it was a staggering amount. Enough to fix the leaking roof, take that trip to Italy Mark, and I had always dreamed of, help Sarah with a down payment on a small condo. But it wasn't the money that snagged my thoughts. It was the why, the mystery of it, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of something else, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't been for a long time. It was a dangerous thought, I knew, but it was there. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, long after Mark's breathing had evened out into a soft snore. The rain had started again, a gentle patter against the window pane, a soothing sound that usually lulled me to sleep. But not tonight. Tonight, my mind was a whirlwind. Julian's offer replayed itself over and over. $50,000 for an evening of my time, my conversation, my insights. It sounded like something out of a movie, a rather unbelievable one at that. Was he eccentric? Lonely? Desperate? Or was there something more to it, something I wasn't grasping? I thought about my life. I loved Mark. I truly did. We'd built a solid, comfortable existence. The kids were launched, doing well. My work at the library was fulfilling in its quiet way. But, was there a but? Had a certain predictability settled over us, a comfortable routine that perhaps bordered on monotony? We didn't talk, not really talk, the way we used to in the early years, full of dreams and arguments and laughter that stretched late into the night. Now, our conversations were mostly logistical, about bills and house repairs, and what to have for dinner. The thought of Julian, his intense gaze, his quiet request for companionship, it stirred something in me. A feeling of being noticed, not as Mark's wife, or Sarah and Ben's mother, but as Eleanor, just Eleanor. And the idea that my insights, as he put it, could be worth something, let alone such a significant sum, was both absurd and strangely validating. I wasn't naive. I knew how this could look, how it could be misinterpreted. What if Mark found out? He'd be hurt, confused, angry. And rightly so if he thought. What was there to think? Julian hadn't proposed anything illicit, not in his words, not in his demeanor. He'd been respectful, almost formal. He wanted to talk. Could it really be that simple? And that complicated? The next morning, I felt like I was moving through a fog. Mark noticed my quietness at breakfast. "Everything all right, Ellie? You seem a bit distracted." "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "Didn't sleep well." "Too much tiramisu." He chuckled, and I felt a pang of guilt. Throughout the day at the library, amidst the comforting scent of old paper and floor wax, Julian's offer echoed in my mind. I tried to dismiss it as the whim of a wealthy, perhaps lonely, man, but it wouldn't be dismissed. The sheer unexpectedness of it had thrown me off balance. What would I even say to him? What kind of insights could I possibly offer someone like Julian Vance, a successful, worldly man? I was just Eleanor from our quiet suburban street. My life was an open book, a rather straightforward one at that. Later that afternoon, while shelving books in the biography section, I came across a slim volume about a woman who had reinvented herself in her 50s after a quiet life. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the title. Personal Discovery. Growth. Weren't those the things I sometimes yearned for? in the quiet moments when the house was empty and the day stretched out before me. Julian hadn't left a phone number or any way to contact him directly. He'd said he was in town for 2 weeks. Dinner had been on Friday. This was Saturday. If I was even to consider, how would it even happen? The answer came that evening. Mark's phone rang. It was Julian. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be engrossed in a recipe, but my ears were pricked. "Hey, Julian. Good to hear from you," Mark said, his voice warm. They chatted for a few minutes about some old college professor they'd both disliked. Then Mark said, "Oh, really? That's thoughtful of you." "Yeah, I'm sure she'd appreciate that." "Hold on, I'll ask her." He covered the mouthpiece and looked at me. That was Julian. He said he really enjoyed your conversation the other night, Eleanor. He's sending over a small thank you gift, a book he thought you might like, related to your interest in local history. He asked for our address to courier it. My heart did a little flip. A book. A thank you gift. It was a perfectly normal, polite gesture. And yet, oh, that's nice of him, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice even. Mark relayed the address, and after a few more pleasantries, hung up. "Such a good guy, Julian," Mark said, shaking his head with a smile. "Always was thoughtful." The book arrived the next afternoon, delivered by a local courier. It was beautifully wrapped. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was not just one book, but 2. One was indeed a fascinating, leather-bound edition on the history of our region. The other was a slim, elegant journal, its pages blank, inviting. Tucked inside the journal was a small, crisp card. On it, in neat, masculine handwriting, was a phone number and a single sentence. "Should you wish to continue our conversation, please feel free to call. Julian." There it was. An invitation. No pressure, no demands, just an open door. My hand trembled slightly as I held the card. This was real. He was serious. The $50,000 hadn't been a flight of fancy, a strange joke. It was a genuine, if unconventional, offer. For the next few days, I lived with that card tucked away in my purse, a secret weight. I'd take it out sometimes when I was alone, staring at the number. To call or not to call? It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. One step could change. Well, I didn't know what it could change. That was the frightening and perhaps alluring part. I thought about Mark. Our life. Our shared history. Was I betraying him by even considering this? But Julian hadn't asked for betrayal. He'd asked for conversation. Was it wrong to want to feel? Interesting again? To explore a part of myself that had perhaps lain dormant? The internal debate was exhausting. I found myself short-tempered with Mark over small things, then overcome with guilt. I wasn't sleeping well, my dreams filled with half-formed anxieties and strange scenarios. One evening, Mark found me staring out the living room window, lost in thought. He came up behind me, gently placing his hands on my shoulders. "What's on your mind, Ellie? You've been a million miles away lately." His voice was concerned, and it cut through my turmoil. I leaned back against him, suddenly weary of my own secrecy. "Just thinking about things, Mark. Life, you know. Getting older." He chuckled softly, kissing the top of my head. "Aren't we all? Don't worry, we're getting older together." His simple, uncomplicated affection was both a comfort and a fresh source of guilt. He trusted me completely. The following Friday, a week after the dinner, I made a decision. I found myself with an unexpected free afternoon. Mark was away on a 2-day fishing trip with his brother, a rare indulgence for him. The house was quiet. I pulled out Julian's card. My finger hovered over the call button on my phone. It wasn't about the money. I told myself that firmly. If I did this, it would be for the experience, for the connection, for whatever it was Julian thought I could offer him, and perhaps for what I might discover about myself in the process. Taking a deep breath, I dialed the number. It rang 3 times, and then his voice, calm and familiar, answered. Julian Vance. Julian, I said, my voice a little shakier than I'd have liked. It's Eleanor. Eleanor Ainsworth. There was a brief pause, then Eleanor. I'm very glad you called. We arranged to meet the following evening. Not at a fancy restaurant, not at his hotel, which I imagined would be some plush downtown establishment. Instead, he suggested a quiet cafe he knew on the outskirts of town, a place known for its secluded atmosphere and late hours. Just for coffee and to talk, he said. No pressure at all. If you change your mind, even at the last minute, I'll understand completely. His understanding, his lack of pressure, paradoxically made it harder to refuse. It felt respectful. Mark was due back from his fishing trip late on Sunday. This would be Saturday evening. I told myself I was simply meeting an old friend of my husband's, someone who was going through a difficult time and needed a sympathetic ear. It sounded so reasonable, so altruistic, when I framed it that way. The $50,000 remained the unspoken, elephant-sized asterisk in the room of my mind. I hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't mentioned it again. That Saturday, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple cashmere sweater and dark trousers. I wanted to look approachable, serious, not anything else. I drove to the cafe, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The place was called the Night Owl, tucked away on a tree-lined street I rarely visited. It was dimly lit with secluded booths and the gentle murmur of quiet conversations. Julian was already there, seated in a corner booth, a book open in front of him. He looked up as I approached, a slight smile touching his lips. Eleanor, thank you for coming. Julian, I said, sliding into the booth. My heart was pounding, a mixture of nerves and a strange sort of anticipation. A waitress appeared, and we ordered coffee. For a few moments, we sat in a comfortable silence, the aroma of roasted beans filling the air. Then he closed his book and looked at me, his gaze direct but kind. I appreciate this more than you know, he said softly. I realized my request was unorthodox. It was, I agreed, finding my voice. Unusual, certainly. Julian, before we go any further, I need to understand. The money. It's a lot, and it makes me uncomfortable. I'm not sure I understand why you felt it was necessary to offer it. He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. I understand your discomfort. Perhaps it was clumsy of me. The truth is, Eleanor, I'm at a crossroads, a very significant one, and the issues I'm grappling with are complex, deeply personal. I value intelligent, unbiased perspective, and I've learned that people's time and insights are valuable. The sum was meant to signify the seriousness of my need, not to buy anything untoward. It was to ensure that you knew I wasn't taking your time, your willingness to listen, lightly. Perhaps it was a way to make a request that I felt I had no right to make otherwise. His explanation, a little formal, a little vulnerable, chipped away at some of my remaining reservations. It still felt surreal, but less transactional, somehow. So you just want to talk? I asked, needing to hear it again. Yes, he said simply. I want to talk. I want to lay out some of the things I'm wrestling with, and perhaps hear what an intelligent, compassionate woman, someone outside my usual sphere, thinks. Someone who seems grounded. Like you. Grounded. Me. It wasn't a word I would have used to describe myself over the past week, but I understood what he meant. He saw me as stable, sensible. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot, strong, and it steadied me. "All right, Julian," I said, meeting his gaze. "Talk." And so he began. He spoke about his company, the immense pressure, the betrayals he'd experienced from people he trusted. He spoke of a recent health scare that had forced him to confront his own mortality. He didn't speak of a wife or children, and I sensed a deep loneliness beneath the surface of his successful life. He wasn't asking for solutions, not exactly. He was thinking aloud, using my presence as a sounding board. I listened mostly. I asked a few questions, prompted him when he paused for too long. I found myself surprisingly comfortable, surprisingly engaged. The hours slipped by. We ordered another round of coffee, then another. The cafe began to empty, but our conversation flowed on, meandering through his concerns, his fears, his hopes. He was a good storyteller, painting vivid pictures with his words, and he was unflinchingly honest about his own failings and uncertainties. There was no pretense, no bravado. Just a man, stripped bare of his public persona, sharing his burdens. And I, Eleanor, the librarian from the suburbs, listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, deeply engaged in a conversation that mattered. It wasn't about leaking roofs or grocery lists. It was about life, the messy, complicated, beautiful, and terrifying business of it. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky outside the cafe window, Julian finally fell silent. He looked drained, but also lighter. A sense of peace had settled over him. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "You have no idea how much this has helped." "I just listened," I said. "You did more than listen," he replied. "You heard. And you didn't judge. That's a rare gift." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. A thick, cream-colored envelope. My stomach lurched. The money. "Julian, He held up a hand. "Please. We had an agreement, and you've given me far more than I could have hoped for." He slid the envelope across the table. It lay there between us, a stark white presence in the dim light. I looked at it, then at him. His expression was sincere, almost pleading. "I can't accept this, Julian," I said, my voice firm, surprising even myself. "I truly can't. What happened tonight? It wasn't about money. Not for me. It was an exchange, a human connection. That's payment enough." He looked taken aback. "Eleanor, I insist. This was part of our understanding." "Perhaps it was your understanding," I said gently. "But it's not mine. Not anymore. If what we shared tonight had a price tag, it would diminish it. For both of us." I pushed the envelope slowly back towards him. "Please, Julian, put it away. The conversation, the trust you showed me, that was more valuable than any amount of money." He stared at the envelope, then at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Surprise, respect, perhaps even relief. He picked it up slowly, his fingers tracing its edges. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Ainsworth," he said quietly. He didn't try to persuade me further. He simply put the envelope back in his pocket. The gesture felt more significant than any words. A weight I hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from my shoulders. We left the cafe as the city was beginning to stir, the air cool and fresh. He walked me to my car. There was an awkward moment, the kind that happens when an unusual intimacy has been shared and the ordinary world reasserts itself. "Will I see you again?" I asked, the question surprising me as it left my lips. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I hope so, Eleanor. Perhaps next time I'm in town, we could have dinner. With Mark, too, of course. A proper dinner, as friends." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. He simply nodded, then said, "Drive safely, Eleanor." And with a small wave, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, a tall, solitary figure disappearing down the waking street. Driving home, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I felt a profound sense of calm and a quiet sort of exhilaration. I hadn't betrayed Mark. I hadn't done anything sordid or secretive in a damaging way. I had connected with another human being on a deep level, offered comfort, and in return, I had been given a gift far more valuable than money. A renewed sense of my own worth, my own capacity for empathy and understanding. I had also rediscovered the power of genuine human connection, something that had perhaps been quietly fading in the comfortable routines of my own life. When I got home, the house was still quiet. Mark wouldn't be back for several hours. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the kitchen window, watching the birds at the feeder in the backyard. The world looked a little brighter, a little sharper. I felt different, stronger, more myself. The $50,000 had been a shocking, bizarre catalyst. But what had transpired was something quiet, something internal, something about dignity and respect for Julian and for myself. Later that day, when Mark returned, full of stories about the fish that got away and the terrible coffee at the fishing lodge, I listened with a new attentiveness. I asked him more questions, drew him out, just as I had with Julian. And when he pulled me close, smelling faintly of lake water and pine needles, I hugged him back with a warmth that felt renewed, more present. Julian and I didn't speak again before he left town. There was no need. We had shared something complete in itself. But a few weeks later, a small package arrived. Inside was a first edition of a poetry book by a local author I'd once mentioned I admired. Tucked inside the front cover was a simple card. "Thank you again, Eleanor. With deepest respect and friendship, Julian." There was no mention of money, no hint of anything other than sincere gratitude. I smiled. This I could accept. This was a gift freely given, freely received. The experience with Julian, as strange and unexpected as it was, had nudged me. It had reminded me that life could hold surprises, that connections could be found in the most unlikely of places, and that sometimes just listening, truly listening, could be the most profound act of all. It also made me look at my own life, my own marriage, with fresh eyes. Mark and I started talking more, not just about logistics, but about our dreams, our fears, the way we used to. It wasn't a dramatic, overnight transformation, but a subtle shift, a deepening. The $50,000 remained an astonishing, almost mythical detail of the story I would probably never tell anyone in its entirety. It was the hook, the unbelievable premise. But what really happened? I found a friend, and in doing so, I found a part of myself I hadn't realized was missing. And that, I knew, was priceless.